Hello everyone, welcome to the talk. My topic is the seven commandments of successful API program. Little bit about me. I'm Sandip Dhummad. I'm director of data engineering at Canada Pension Plan Investments. So let's dive right into the today's topic. So the most important thing in today's world is that digital transformation is helping business gain a significant success. But on the flip side of it is that there is a report from Google Cloud called the Digital Crunch Time 2022 State of API and Application. In that report, they had mentioned that there are only small percentage, like about only 20% of the companies are getting the full potential of their digital transformation. And what they are saying is that they are planning to further leverage the cloud and API and microservices for improving the gain. So from that, the, what is quite evident is that A, they are not successful in their digital transformation journey, and B, the cloud and API are the key enablers for them to get their success. Now, so if the API is very important, now if you look at the API programs, how successful are these in the organizations? In the same report, what they talked about is that there are only 34% of the leaders, they are saying that their API program has a high maturity. So what's wrong? What is causing these API programs to have a low maturity or medium maturity? There are so many significant issues that you run into or challenges that you run into while running your API program. But as they say, for the best API program or most successful API program, you need to have a sound strategy, API strategy. So what I have done is that I have asked the most knowledgeable person in this world, ChatGPT, to help us figure out what should be my API strategy look like. So it told me, very simple thing: identify your business objectives, define any API program, create an API governance model, implement API management tools, create developer ecosystem, and measure success. Great recipe for the successful enterprise API strategy. Who would not agree in this audience with with these steps? Everybody will agree, right? But the problem in this is that even if you execute all these steps in the same sequence, will it guarantee you to have your API program being a high maturity program? Will it guarantee you to be part of that 34%? Probably the answer is no. Reason why? Because what differentiate or distinguishes the program from high maturity to low maturity is not the steps or the things that you have to do as part of API strategy. It's all about how you go about implementing these things as part of your API strategy. So with that, what we had gone through this journey of implementing a successful API program. We had gone through a lot of challenges. At the end of this, here is the summary. These are the seven commandments which I think will help you make your API program a successful high maturity program. These are the seven tenets. The first tenet, number one, is know the real problem. Every organization is different. The all API strategy talks about is API management, implementing API management platform, governance, etc. This is all a great start. Defining the mission, the objectives of an API program, everything is great. But are these the real problems that you are trying to solve? Are these a problem which is going to make a big difference, or being a help you build a differentiating capability for your organization and then expose that through an API? Probably not. So that's the very first thing. Know your real problem that can hamper the success of your API program. The second thing is design an API ecosystem upfront by business domain. One of the biggest problem in any API program is API sprawl. It's very easy to build an API. All the API management platform and everything, they help you, get the agility that you need, and that's their main the pitch for the platform, and that's all great. You need all that thing, but at the same time, something which is very easy to do can lead you to an API sprawl problem, and how do you avoid that problem? Maybe you have to design, you have to think thoroughly and design these things up front, and that's where the second tenet comes in handy. The third tenet is preventing the real problems from ground up. So you know what is your real problems. How do you infuse these things as part of your architecture, as well as part of your people, process, and tool to help you prevent these real problems ground up. That is, this is very key for a mature API program. The fourth one, if you build all the APIs with the great architecture, designing them upfront, solving all the problems, but if people don't know what API exists within an organization, that leads to an API silo. For me, if I don't know what API exists, if I cannot discover an API that exists within an organization, to me, that API does not exist at all. I think the most important thing for any successful API program is that API democratization. Make sure each and every API is accessible and discoverable to everyone within an organization, and they should be able to try that API without any hurdle. The fifth thing is API governance. When we talk about maturity, the governance automatically comes into the play. Now, governance, when we say, our general thought process is that, governance should be done by a governing body, and that body can be a centralized body. What we are seeing is that, have you seen that Netflix's microservices architecture diagram having so many dots representing microservice and they are connecting to each other? That diagram, sounds very fascinating to me when I'm as a developer or as an engineer. But when I wear the enterprise architecture hat or API governance hat, to me it's very scary. And then I'm sure that majority of the organizations runs into that sort of situation where you get so many APIs that you are delivering and building as part of your applications and then products. But how do you go about governing them? Will that one centralized team be helpful? You have to thoroughly think through the federated decentralized API governance method for help solve that problem. And what does that look like? The next tenet is, when we talk about API and API maturity, I think that the highest number of security attacks which are happening these days are on API security attacks. And you have to make sure that you build the API architecture with built-in security and operational control. If you don't do it, then you will run into a lot of issues, and that will make your API program to be, uh, you know, not so successful. The last thing, your in the organization, your first-class citizen for your API programs are the developers or engineers. If the engineers don't adopt everything that you put together, your standards, your best practices, your API management platform, your processes, the program does not exist for the organization. You have to make sure that you go with them. You have all the developers come along with you on your API journey. They should have a high level of adoption. They should be the ones who are driving the API maturity within your organization. How do you make it happen? That's where the culture and the developer evangelism comes into play. And then I will talk about what we have done for all of these seven tenets or the commandments through our API journey to make our API programs highly successful. Number one, know the real problem. As they said, the problem well stated is the problem half solved. We all know that, our method of knowing the real problem says, you go and then talk to the different stakeholders. For API program, your stakeholders are the developers, the API consumers, architect, QA. When we did their survey, we just learned about the classic problems. The developer is saying that, I don't have an ability of using the cool tool out there in the market or the technology out there in the market. Or they will say that I'm writing a lot of boilerplate code. Architect is saying, the tech debt, there is not maturity, there are no standards. When it comes to consumer are complaining about, I don't know what API exists. There is no central repository. There is no way of me to search the APIs. The APIs are very slow. The APIs are redundant, and likewise. These are all very common problems. These problems are not specific to API. These problems are also common problems for, in general, any software development that we do. But I think the main thing about is that yes, these all these problems are important, but are these the problems really talking about how it can help you improve the maturity of your API program? You have to dig down. What we have done is that we use these feedbacks as an inside out. We also look at the outside in view of looking at a lot of Gartner, Forrester research, talking to so many API management vendors, trying to understand the entire API technology landscape, and try to figure out what are the different things that we have to handle and manage as part of our API journey. And in the end, we figured that these are the different key issues and challenges that we have to manage for the high maturity program. The first challenge that we will run into is the API sprawl. We talked about it. There are so many redundant APIs. I'll give you an example where when we were working on this API management program, the one of the most important API, we had 7 copies of it within an organization, and then the consumer has a big difficulty figuring out which one is the API that they should be using it. The next challenge that we saw is the API silo. The APIs are not discoverable. There's no centralized repository, as the consumer talked about. And then the third challenge is, there is no these implementation standards that everybody needs to follow. These standards can, and then along with the standards, there is no technology accelerators or the framework that people can bank on that they can use for implementing the APIs in the consistent manner. If there is no consistency, there is no standardization, there will always be an issue of API sprawl because people don't know how to do it and etc. API documentation, big important thing. We saw that there was lack of centralized API documentation. Security, we were using so many different security mechanisms for different types of an API. Uh, be it a web service or RESTful API, even within the specific type of web service or RESTful API, there were different schemes of technology which is being used by ensuring the security of the API. The slow time to market. When we go to an executive, they are saying that people are asking for 2 to 3 months for building an API, and they are like, what are we doing? Are we in 1980s? Are we in today's day and age, the API development should be quick enough. What is the gap here? The next problem is API performance, and the one other problem that we have seen, which is the sort of root cause of so many of other these problems that we talked about, is underfetching and overfetching. We had seen that so many existing API or web services, they were either fetching too little data or too much data. If they are fetching too much of data, that leads to a performance problem. If they are fetching too little data, then they are leading us to the API sprawl and the API silo and sort of issues. So we thought that this is a key problem that we have to solve in order for us to improve the maturity. And based on these problems and things, we figured that these are the capabilities that we should be building on: API democratization, standardization, governance, and whatnot. May have mentioned about those things as in the previous slide as part of the canon. So and then this is one more slide. I just want to quickly go through it here that, by looking at everything, in the end, what we have done is we have defined a very detailed API capability model that someone can use it for driving their selection of an API management platform as well as successful implementation of an API management platform, because that is key for driving the success of API management, API strategy. Let's move on to the second problem: design an API ecosystem upfront by business domain. So as we talked about, there are so many issues around the API sprawl, which is one of the real problem for the maturity perspective. How can we solve that problem? So usually what happens in API strategy or journey, people define these this strategy uh, where they define standards, best practices, and leave it up to, and then they build the technology platform, API management platform, and give it to a developer so that developers can go about leveraging these things and then start building their API. But I think we need to go further up. We have to go for one level down, where instead of letting developer build whatever they need to build for meeting their business requirements, I think maybe what we could do is, every business has a conceptual business model based on, like, they have level 1 capability, level 2 capability, level 3 capability. As you see in this diagram here, I have level one capabilities defined for one of our business domains, for our business model. So the idea here is that can we upfront design the data API, because API has a layering, data API, application API, business API. Can we upfront design data API and start building these data APIs by this business model that will help institutionalize the domain driven design in an organization, that will also help institutionalize the API as a product within an organization. And I understand, and we realize that the domains are not always straightforward to work on, because there could be so many applications, they are serving the same domain model. But that will be a level 2, level 3 capability. I think what you have to carefully figure it out is that at the end of the day, even though there are multiple applications cutting across multiple business units working on same domain, they would be working off of a specific single source of truth data set, and you may want to build data API on that. So you might have a level 2, level 3 capability saying that the market risk and commodity risk and liquidity risk as the level 2, level 3 capability, pointing to a respective single source of truth data, which that's the design as an architect you have to do upfront, and then lay out your API roadmap following to implement that design. That will help streamline a lot of these data API implementation, and then help reduce the API sprawl. Also help make the API endpoints very intuitive by the business domain. Nobody has to remember what is that API endpoint going to look like following REST principles. Like, give an example. For party APIs, there's always slash parties. We know that we have a business domain called trade. There will always be an API called slash trades. Now, moving on to the next thing, preventing real problems from ground up. So what we have done is that we looked at all the problems and we try to figure out what are the different approaches that we can apply to help solve these problems. As you can see in this slide, for API sprawl problem, which is one of the biggest problem for the maturity, there are so many things that you have to do. Like, one example, API implementation framework you have to work on, API standards so that everybody implements the same way. You have to work on communities of practice for the API democratization. Then you have to, the bottom line is that for API sprawl, I'll just take one example of this busy slide. For API sprawl, if I want to handle that, I have to basically take care of consistent API design and implementation. We'll have to take care of API democratization, making sure that all these APIs are available to everyone. You have to take care of API governance, right? You have to take care of culture and developer evangelism. And then you have to take care of underfetching and overfetching problem, and you have to take care of domain-driven design, which is the previous slide we talked about. So you have to take care of these things, and for each of these things, what are the different things that you have to do? You can see that. So there are quite a lot of work that has to go behind taking care of this problem ground up. Now the question is, how and when, how and where you can help solve this problem, where you can implement this. So what we have done is, today's day and age, in DevOps operating model, the mantra is that shift left. But how much you're gonna shift left to a developer? We are already shifting left development activity, operations activity, security activity, testing activity to a developer. There is so much that developer has to do. I believe if you want to have a great deal of maturity, and that developer don't have a time, great deal of maturity, I think the things that you have to do is that you have to make sure that some of these things are even taken further left. What do I mean by further left? Is that there should be some technology accelerators and frameworks which are built for the developers, so that they take care of majority of these things for them, and then give them a very solid playground on which they can operate on. What do I mean by that? So as you can see in here, this is our API development lifecycle look like. As you can see that I, as an engineer, if I need to build an API, what we have done is we have built an API scaffolding engine. The API scaffolding engine takes the API blueprint as an input. The API blueprint is essentially an API template. That API template considers our API standards which are defined. That includes different cross-cutting aspects of an API, and then also it takes use of the API implementation framework, because there are so many cross-cutting aspects that you have to implement, reuse them. So that's all built as part of API implementation framework. Now it takes that as an input, and then it also takes the standard API CI/CD pipeline template as an input, and it generates the scaffolding engine will generate an API Git repository that has the standard code structure and branching. It will also have the end-to-end implementation of reference services, and the second thing it will build is the API CI/CD pipeline. Because see, at the end of the day, my tenets for managing the maturity is how people go about is the consistent design and implementation. That's all how people go about doing an implementation. That's your Git repo, because you have now end-to-end reference implementation, and then you have standard code structure and branching. And the second thing is that how I go about building and deploying this API code into the production. So the CI/CD pipeline, what it does is that it helps in doing an API code deployment. It takes care of doing an API proxy deployment. It takes care of API generating an API documentation. So let's take about the API code deployment. The API code, it will deploy it on Kubernetes cluster in our ecosystem. You can also deploy it on Lambda. It's all CI/CD pipeline implementation. No big deal. Generally, when we talk about an API, the API code and API proxy, we think them as two separate entity, and usually, there's two separate CI/CD pipeline. If we combine them into one, because we know for sure that there is a standard way of building an API proxy for any API. We can standardize that, because the policies that you want to implement, there should be default policies by API type. If it's an external API versus internal API, you have set of policies that you want to apply consistently across the board, and that's something that you can automate as part of your API proxy deployment. Essentially, it's nothing but API proxy is nothing but some sort of configuration file. We implemented APG, so there was a configuration file that has bunch of policies that you want to use. You can standardize all that, and then you can register that API proxy to an API management platform. And then when it comes to documentation, you can register the documentation on API developer portal. The other thing that you can standardize through this pipeline is that standard API testing, because how you go about doing an API security testing is same. It doesn't matter what API endpoint is look like. How you go to give you an example, how you go about doing standard the SQL injection testing, header bomb testing, the payload size testing or payload. It's the same thing. So we can standardize some of these test cases and then run that as part of the API CI/CD pipeline. So by the main message that I'm trying to tell you here is that this is the investment that you have to do to make your API program successful, and that investment basically will help you bring the standard design and implementation and the deployment, and also standardization on so many different aspects of an API. Comes the API democratization, as we talked about. Again, there's not much to say here. The one thing that I would like to point out is that, as we have seen in the previous slide, that the standard CI/CD pipeline takes care of publishing the API documentation to the developer portal, so that everybody has an access to it. And then people can every API on the developer portal is documented, published, so anybody within the organization can search it, and then they can use it in the self-service manner. And if you bring this level of maturity, I think that will avoid a need of me knowing Zach or me knowing Mark for a specific API. We should not have any such sort of things, because that leads to a data silo that breaks the data silo ground up. Now, moving on to API governance. Now, we talked about this, the business domain and domain model, and then building data APIs across that. Now, what we have done for setting up the federated decentralized API governance, as I talked about, the centralized API governance is something which will not scale well in the API world. So what you can do is, for each of these domains, you can appoint somebody who is SME in that area as your API product owner, because it's the concept of API as a product. You have an API product owner. That API product owner will be responsible for governing that particular domain. Make sure that there are no APIs sprawling that domain, and all the APIs which are built for that domain are consistently following all our standards that we have defined. And then I think and how it will play out. So as we looked at that CI/CD pipeline, it publishes the API documentation on developer portal. Other than API documentation, it will also publish the certain, it will make this API documentation into the pending mode. So the idea here is that these API, the developer who has worked on that API, they have to come in, they have to start feeding the metadata of an API product, because every API product would have a metadata, like technical metadata that talks about the all the endpoints and the inputs, model object. You will also have business metadata and then operational metadata. Business metadata talks about what is this API for, what is trying to serve, uh, and then operational metadata is all about what is the API SLA, and stuff like that. You have to feed in that information. The most important thing that you have to feed in as part of their, for making this API to be available to the everyone in the organization, is that they have to feed in the domain and subdomain information. That domain and subdomain, as soon as they feed in the domain and subdomain information, as part of metadata, what will happen is that this API uh, will will be, communicated, like the API product owner will get communicated. Like, take an example, if somebody is saying, this, the API that I'm building as an engineer, this is a party API. The party API's API product owner will get notified. He will review this and make sure that the API is as per the standards, is also not doing any API sprawl. He will approve it, and once he approves it, that goes into an API portal for everybody to consume. That's very simple model that helps scale this program greatly. And then all these API product owners are part of the API governance community. These are the people, they form the governance for the entire ecosystem. The other thing is, um, this governance community also will have a reports. What these reports will do is, every day they will run the report. They will check if there is an API endpoint, is that in the pending state on the developer portal because it's missing out the essential metadata. If that happens, then it will send out an email communication to that person saying that, hey, you know what, you are breaching the SLA. And it will also send the report to the senior management saying that on developer portal, these are the 10 APIs which have been there in pending status, waiting for developers to come and act on it and enter the information in last more than 7 days. You then you know then that that will basically drive a lot of maturity in overall process, where the developers has to act on, make sure that every API that they build is being published out on developer portal. This is a simple governance process that helps, not only make sure that the APIs which are being developed are adhering to a standard. It makes sure that there is no API sprawl. It also makes sure that all the documentations which is required and the metadata which is required for the API product is being published out, so that everybody within your organization has in full access of this data. So breaking the API silo. The next thing about the building the security and operational control. Again, this is a very wide area. I don't want to get into. I don't have a lot of time to get into the details. But one thing that we have seen is that no matter what API management platform you pick, the architecture is very standard. Measure it's basically built of 5 components. One is the API manager, which is the centralized API repository, if you will, right? Then you will have an developer portal, and then you'll have API Pro portal. The developer portal is for the consumers. API portal is for the API developers. They can come in, they build the proxy. And then there is an API gateway, which is the runtime component that does the PEP, policy enforcement. And there will be an analytical store that captures all the API analytics. Out of all these components, when we looked at it, the only most majority of these components are design time components, like API portal, and then API manager, and then the developer portal is all a design time component. Only components which are runtime are the API gateway and analytical store. With that information in mind, what we have done is that when you build the API management infrastructure for your organization, you have to make sure that there is a network and infrastructure layer security built in, other than the API security we talked about, where there is a clear isolation of the API infrastructure by the environment, by the type of an API, and by the business unit, if that's the requirement. Just to give an example, here in this diagram, you can see that there is a separate API gateway for the public subnet, for the public API, as well as for the internal API. There is a separate subnets for the development environment, as well as for the or sorry, there is a separate API gateway for the lower environment and the higher environment, meaning production environment. This isolation basically helps you greatly, because you can now design the separate API policies for the internal API versus the private API versus public API. You can also have a separate sets of policy for the lower environment versus higher environment, and you can also standardize and automate that as part of your standard CI/CD pipeline we talked about. Other than that, there are so many other things that you can do. As we talked about, you can do an API security testing as part of standard CI/CD pipeline, and then you also leverage an out-of-the-box policies for for implementing the cross-cutting concerns as part of your API endpoint on the API management platform. The last thing, but not least, the most important thing, developer evangelism. How can you bring developers to become an ambassador of your API program and help drive, they take a lead and help drive the API program to the rest of the organization? The way, the mechanism that we have implemented was the communities of practice. Like we talked about API governance communities of practice, we also have an API communities of practice where it acts as a body of knowledge. That body of knowledge can help define standards, best practices, guidelines, and anti-patterns. So these are the developers who come in, they jointly collaborate and define the standards and best practices. So because now they are defining, they will take the ownership, and they will also become an ambassador for spreading these things out to the rest of the organization. They also become they also take the responsibility of evangelism. They will basically help contribute in writing blogs, doing tech talks, office hours, to help solve the people's problem in implementing these standards for their application. This helped us greatly in adoptions and optimization. So I think these are the the commandments or the tenets. If you implement properly within your organization, I believe that you can have a successful high maturity API program for an organization. With that, I'll conclude and I'll open it up for the questions. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks.